Abraham's life was one of movement. He was called to leave pass through Haran, and eventually enter Canaan, the land God had promised him. But with all this movement came a question. How does one worship a God who cannot be confined to a temple, a city, or a carved image? For Abraham, the answer was written in canvas, in stone, and in trees. His tents, his altars, and the oaks he settled near became the stages of his worship practices. Simple, mobile, and yet deeply theological. We often picture worship as something that happens in grand cathedrals, ornate sanctuaries, or majestic temples. But Abraham's world was very different. His sanctuary was a tent that could be moved as easily as the herds of sheep and cattle he guided. His sacred spaces were marked by stones gathered into altars. And the great trees, the oaks of Mamre, and Beersheba, served as meeting points where heaven and earth seemed to touch. To understand Abraham's faith, we need to see how these symbols were more than practical. They were a declaration of his theology, a testimony to a God who walked with his people, even as they wandered. The tent was Abraham's home. Genesis repeatedly reminds us that Abraham dwelt in tents, not palaces or walled cities. This wasn't merely because he was a nomadic herdsman. The tent symbolized impermanence, a reminder that he was a sojourner in a land not yet his own. Hebrews 11:9-10 reflects on this very reality. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Abraham's tent was a daily reminder that this world was temporary. Every time the canvas was rolled up and the poles packed away, he and his household were reminded that their true dwelling was not yet here, but with God's future promise. But tents alone did not mark Abraham's worship. Each time he entered a new region, Genesis records that he built an altar. At Shechem, after God promised the land to his descendants, Abraham built an altar to the Lord, Genesis 12:7. At Bethel he built another and called upon the name of the Lord, Genesis 12:8. Later at Hebron by the oaks of Mamre, he built yet another altar, Genesis 13:18. These altars weren't elaborate shrines. They were simple stacks of stones, likely with a flat surface where sacrifices could be placed. But their importance was monumental. In a land filled with pagan shrines and idols, Abraham's altars declared that here, in this place, Yahweh alone was God. They were public markers of faith, visible testimonies to the surrounding peoples that Abraham worshipped a God who was unseen, yet very real. Consider the contrast. In Mesopotamia, Abraham would have seen towering ziggurats, massive step temples built to bridge heaven and earth. In Egypt, temples rose with statues of deities carved from stone. But Abraham's altar was humble. No idol stood upon it. No walls enclosed it. It was raw earth and uncut stone, pointing to the Creator rather than creation. His worship was intentionally simple, because the God he followed was not bound to a structure, nor represented by an image. Abraham's altar said, in effect, the living God is present here, wherever his people call on his name. Then there were the oaks, the great trees of Canaan. Genesis tells us that Abraham camped by the oak of Mamre, Genesis 12:6, later by the oaks of Mamre near Hebron, Genesis 13:18, and eventually planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, where he called upon the Lord, Genesis 21:33. These were not random camping spots. In the ancient Near East, large trees often carried sacred significance. Canaanite religions used groves for idol worship, believing such places were dwelling spots of the gods. Abraham's choice to dwell by oaks and to call on the Lord, there was a counterclaim. He wasn't honoring the tree itself, but consecrating a space where false worship had flourished, declaring it instead to be ground devoted to Yahweh. This act was bold. Imagine moving into enemy territory and setting up a rival flag in the center of town. That is what Abraham's altars by the oaks represented. They announced to all who passed by, "This God, the one who called Abraham out of Ur, is Lord even here." In this way, the oaks became landmarks of faith, fixed points in the shifting journey of a nomadic life. The pattern is striking. Tents for living, altars for worship, and oaks for witness. Together, they paint a picture of mobile faith anchored in eternal promises. Abraham's worship practices remind us that true faith doesn't require stability of place or permanence of structure. It requires trust in God's presence. Think about what this means for us today. Many of us associate worship with a building, church walls, pews, pulpits, and stained glass. Those are wonderful, but Abraham's story challenges us. Do we see worship as something tied to a location, or as a life lived wherever God leads us? When you pack your things and move to a new city, when you take on a new job, when you find yourself in unfamiliar places, do you, like Abraham, build altars in those spaces? Not of stone, but of prayer, testimony, and faithfulness. There's also a profound reminder in the tent. We live in an age where stability and security are idolized. We crave permanence. But Abraham's life testifies that our permanence is not here. We too are sojourners, seeking a city with foundations, as Hebrews says. The tent whispers to us that comfort is temporary, but God's promises are eternal. The oaks remind us of courage. Abraham did not shy away from worshipping God in the very locations where others bowed to idols. In our own world, we too are called to plant our faith in the midst of competing voices, declaring that Christ alone is Lord. When Abraham planted a tree at Beersheba and called on the eternal God, Genesis 21:33, it wasn't just a personal act. It was a public proclamation. In the same way, when we stand firm in faith, we bear witness not only for ourselves, but for those who see us. And finally, the altar reminds us of sacrifice. Abraham's altars pointed forward to something greater. Every stone, every act of calling on God's name was a foreshadow of the ultimate altar, where God himself would provide the sacrifice. Centuries later, at another wooden structure, God's promise to Abraham would be fulfilled. Jesus, the descendant of Abraham, would offer himself as the once-for-all sacrifice. The simple stone altars scattered across Canaan were mere shadows compared to the cross. So, as we reflect on Abraham's worship practices, his tents, his altars, and the oaks, we see not relics of an ancient culture, but living symbols for faith today. They challenge us to hold lightly to this world, to boldly declare our worship in public, and to trust the eternal God who walks with his people wherever they go. Abraham's life teaches us that worship doesn't need walls. It doesn't need temples of gold. It needs a heart that trusts God enough to pitch a tent wherever he leads, build an altar of faith wherever he provides, and plant a tree of testimony wherever he calls us to stand. And that's why Abraham's story continues to inspire us today. Because even as he wandered, he never lost sight of the one who promised him a home. And in the end, that's the story of all who follow the God of Abraham. We are pilgrims now, but heirs of an eternal city yet to come.